on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program the president of the Credo Super PAC, Becky Bond. Hi, Becky.
Oh, hey, Sam. It's great to be with you guys. As we are in the run-up to election, I'm so sick of hearing the pundits on television and on the radio and in the news, and it's so nice to be with a host and an audience, that are real progressives, people that are actually really fighting for what's right in this election. So I couldn't be happier to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, tell me from your perspective, because we don't hear, so much of the implications, I think, of this midterm election are glossed over. I suppose theoretically we could say this at every election, but there are some real dangers, I think, here for progressives in particular if the Democrats lose the Senate. First off, fast track authority strikes me in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its EU trade deal, or cousin, I should say. But tell me some of the other issues that I think are relevant in the context of the Democrats losing the Senate in this midterm.
Oh, well, no questions elections matter. Even if you don't like the Democrats who are running, what happens matters, and it matters probably to progressives more than anyone else. We did see in the New York Times a story leaked from White House sources saying that the president is trying to figure out how he can compromise to cut deals on fast track authority, on the trade deal, on the TPP. Other things that are almost certain to happen, McConnell has said that he'll use reconciliation to whack away at the Affordable Care Act piece by piece with only 51 votes. This is something that progressives urged the Democrats to do when passing health care reform, to use reconciliation and pass a strong bill, but Democrats wouldn't do it. And here McConnell is, a week out from the election saying, one of the first things we're going to do is use reconciliation and start dismantling Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And we're also going to see, the president probably coming to the table with McConnell and others to cut the grand bargain on Social Security and Medicare. It's something that the president wanted to do before. It's something that Harry Reid and the Democratic Senate stopped him from doing, thanks to activism from not just progressives, but the majority of Americans who don't want to see those programs cut. But we're likely to see them go to the table and the president to get the deal that he always wanted without Harry Reid in the Senate as the firewall. We're also likely to see the Republicans basically stop every single executive or judicial appointment for the rest of President Obama's term, and that means that these lifetime appointments that we need on the federal judiciary, these lifetime appointments where we'll have people ruling on state issues like the 6-week abortion bans, like voting rights cases. We need progressive, pro-Constitution judges in those lifetime appointments, because for the next generation, the attacks that are coming at the state level on women, on people of color, on voting rights, on corporations fighting for the right to pollute, that's our front line of defense of these federal judges. And Republicans are going to do everything they can to block any nomination that's progressive at all coming from the White House.
And so, all right. So, give us a sense. I mean, we've spoken on this program obviously about how the issue for Democrats across the country is really one of turnout. I mean, if we saw 2012 turnout levels, we wouldn't even be there'd be not a lot to talk about, frankly. But we're obviously not going to see that because it's not a presidential election. There are structural differences in the Republican and Democratic parties, whereby we see off-year elections just do not garner the same level of voter participation, or there's a drop. The drop-off is, I should say, more extreme on the Democratic side than it is on the Republican side. What are you guys doing, and what races are you targeting?
So that's a great question. In a midterm election, it really does come out to progressive-based turnout. And when we have an unpopular president who's even unpopular with a lot of Democrats right now, who hasn't delivered for key constituents, he hasn't delivered on climate, he hasn't delivered on immigration reform, he has largely not delivered on the economic and jobs agenda. A lot of our progressive-based voters, they don't necessarily see a strong reason to go out and vote, even though it's important. And so what we have to do is we actually have to go door to door and visit those voters who vote in presidential years who are not likely to turn out this year, and we have to tell them it's important to vote and get them to the polls. And that's what Credo SuperPAC's been working on since June. We're in North Carolina, we're in Colorado, we're in Kentucky, we're in Michigan. We've been working on the Georgia race, and what we've been doing is going door to door, recruiting volunteers and going door to door and talking to these progressive drop-off voters to get them to the polls. We've also had local people phone banking since the summer. Right now, and we're in GOTV right now, and there's heavy calling and door knocking. We've just knocked on about 65,000 doors with local people who are like the voters that they are talking to, local people on the phones talking to people, and having really quality conversations to make sure that they know it's important to get out to the polls. And if the party committees of the campaigns spend half the money they're spending on negative television advertising, which doesn't move voters to the polls, if they spent half that money on field, on the ground game, we wouldn't be seeing these news reports, saying Republicans are poised to take the Senate. We wouldn't lose the Senate if we spent money on mobilization. And so there's the issue of this isn't a presidential year, and progressive-based voters, they're not as consistent voters as other folks. But we have to look at other things. In a presidential year, we saw this president run 2 amazing campaigns where he had volunteers going door to door, turning out voters. And we don't have that in this midterm election because that's not the kind of campaigns that the party committees have elected to run. And so that's what Credo Super PAC is doing on the ground in some key states, building infrastructure, getting local people involved in these races. And if these races are close, our work, will be part of having made the difference.
There's actual. This is not, we should just say, this is not conjecture. There's been a lot of research, particularly as of late, which shows what motivates a voter to get to the poll if they're on the fence. And it is, in fact, that face-to-face encounter is far more effective than anything else. And I remember, we spoke at Netroots Nation in Detroit. I guess it was in July, and you had just come back from meeting with some local people who were manning that field operation. So let's start with, why do you think? It seems somewhat obvious to me, but it may not be to our audience. Why do you think that more money is spent on those negative ads than, say, building an infrastructure where you have local people going out and talking to other local people and getting them to vote?
Yeah, there's a few answers to that question, and it's so frustrating because, like you said, there's a growing body of evidence that shows, there's no more effective way to run a campaign than to have local people going door to door talking to voters and urging them to vote. And especially in a midterm election when turnout is low, there's a small number of persuadable people out there. But what you really need to do is just find the people that already agree with you and make sure they vote. Right? That's a much easier thing to do than actually persuade people that are on the fence. And it also, we as progressives, when you're going after the persuadable vote, you're making compromises to appeal to people that don't share your values in order to get them to vote. And we could have much more progressive majorities if we actually could move the people that agree with us to vote more often. And, I think there's a few things that are happening. I think that, for one thing, if you want to build this volunteer based field operation in the states, you have to pick your races and start working on it. We picked our races in April, and we were on the ground with offices opening in June. And that's before most national groups ever decide what races that they want to work on. And so you have to make choices, and you have to invest early because it takes time to build these operations.
Why don't they do that? Is it because they're not gearing towards actually the ideology of those people? Why are you guys able to do that and other organizations are not?
There's a few things. One is it's just a lot of work to manage these operations with a lot of people. It's much easier to run a bank account and wire money into advertising agencies' accounts and run ads. You can have 2 people in D.C. in a bank account and run that kind of campaign. From this kind of campaign, you have to hire, dozens and dozens of people and manage them and start early. And I think a lot of groups they only want to work in the closest contests, and we don't know for sure what the closest contests are until after, September or October, really. And so you have to be willing to make a bet and get into it. I think another huge problem is that, so much political work at the national level is done by consultants, and consultants don't get a percentage of volunteer field organizing. They simply don't, right? They just don't. People in D.C. don't make money off of running field operations. What they make money off of is selling advertising. They get a percentage of the media buy. They have a media production firm on the side that they're a partner in, and so the problem is the consultants get paid win or lose, and the consultants get paid a lot of money when they're involved in advertising-heavy campaigns. And your average donor is just not, to be honest, your average donor is just not necessarily educated about the science and about the evidence to show, what has a greater return. And I think campaigns really do a disservice not just to voters and to progressive ideals, but also to their donors by misspending their money and losing races. And I think we need to change something about the economics and the system of rewards where people make money whether they win or lose by running these big advertising campaigns.
That dynamic with consultants, we should say, seems to stretch across many, many different industries, maybe not coincidentally. But all right, so let's talk about specifically the races that you are engaged in: Kentucky, Colorado, North Carolina, Michigan, and Georgia. What are you hearing from the folks who are working on the ground? And I guess, I know that it must be tough if they're in this sort of bubble where they're only talking to voters who they think are already, willing to vote for the Democratic candidate, just not necessarily willing to actually vote. It's tough to necessarily get a sense from them. But I'm curious, like in a place like Kentucky, in Colorado in particular, what are the people who are on the ground saying to you?
Well, so I was just in Kentucky, and I was knocking on doors, talking to voters, who are at risk of not turning out, and making sure they knew where their polling place was, making sure they knew how they were going to get to the polls. And overwhelmingly, what we're hearing on the ground in a place like Kentucky is that the people who want McConnell out have a lot more passion than the people who want to keep McConnell in. And, even the Credo Super PAC volunteers in Louisville, they're getting robocalled by the McConnell campaign. Now think about what a waste that is, like for McConnell to be robocalling not just Democrats, but progressive activists, right? In that campaign, and that's the kind of campaign he's running. Meanwhile, we've got all these activists who are actually out there every day talking to voters that they can see on their sheet of paper that they voted in 2008 and voted in 2012 but didn't vote in 2010. And they're doing, what it takes to explain to those folks that the race is close. I mean, in a race like Kentucky, and we've seen this in other races where you have an incumbent who, he's been reelected with wide margins in his recent elections, but it's really because no one mounted a serious campaign against him. So what you have with the Grimes campaign is the first time Democratic voters have had to actually think that their vote would matter in a race that's really close. And the people on the ground, they say they don't trust the polls. They're actually quite sophisticated. They say they think a lot of people are going to vote that the pollsters aren't counting. They think a lot of people are motivated by the fact that this is the first time that McConnell's really in danger. I talked to voters that I could see had voted in 2008 and 2012, but not 2010. And I talked to them and said, not only am I voting, but all 6 people in our household are voting. We're going to the polls together. We're going to go at 6:30 in the morning. I talked to a woman who was 85 years old, and she had not voted in 2012, but she'd voted in the last 3 elections. And I asked her why she had not made it to the polls in 2012, and she said, well, I went, but the line was too long, and I couldn't stand that long, so I went home. And I said, well, what are you going to do this year? And she said, I'm going to, the polling place opens at 6, and I'm going to go at 6 because there's not going to be a line there, and I'm going to make sure that my vote gets counted. So it's hard to say in any of these contests. They're really close, and we know that in 2006 and in 2010, in toss-up Senate races, Democratic performance was undercounted by about 4 points. And so, if these races are within 3 points based on the polls, and Democrats are being undercounted by 3 or 4 points in terms of their performance, then we can see we'll see some upsets. But again, it's too close to call, and it's all going to come down to the ground game. And I would say if we lose the Senate, I think we shouldn't blame voter apathy. I think we should blame a Democratic establishment that spent hundreds of millions of dollars on television advertising instead of building the neighbor-to-neighbor field campaigns that that were built to elect the president in 2008 and 2012, the kind of campaign that's being run by Mark Buttigieg in Alaska, the kind of campaigns that I think is going to save Mark Udall in Colorado. We need to see the Democratic establishment spend monies in ways that doesn't let down Democratic voters and progressive activists.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is also getting to the donor class and basically educating them, right? And requiring them to have a greater, I guess, demand a greater level of accountability in terms of where their money goes. So your sense is in Colorado, too, that Udall has a good chance?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, we saw this with Bennett. I mean, in 2010, all the polls pointed to the fact that he was going to lose. It was because the polls weren't counting a lot of the voters that were being mobilized by the door-to-door canvasses. In Colorado, because it's been a contentious presidential state, activists in Colorado understand that what you need to do is go door-to-door and talk to voters. And so when you ask them to do that, they know how to do it. They know it's important that they're out there. So there's a lot more people knocking on doors for the Mark Udall campaign than there are for the Grimes campaign or for the Hagan campaign. And so I think where we see a bigger ground game, then Democrats are more likely to win. I think it's that simple.
And finally, let me ask you about Georgia, because Georgia, it seems to me, has been sort of a sleeper throughout this race. Very underreported, I think, is sort of the organizing that's gone around their own Moral Mondays in Georgia. I mean, people talk about Moral Mondays happening in North Carolina, but there's been significant organizing in Georgia as well. Give me a sense of what you're hearing from your folks on the ground there.
I think Georgia is a really tough one. I think this is, to be totally honest, this is really David Perdue's race to lose. I think Georgian activists are, they're always asked to go to Florida and help win, other races, and finally they have a race of national importance in their own backyard with the Senate race, and it's really been Perdue telling the truth about his support for outsourcing and proud of being an outsourcer, and of course he closed down plants all the time, and making those statements that are making Georgians, black and white Georgians, wake up and say, well, this is not someone who's going to care about our record jobless rates here in Georgia, and it's going to be a really tough race to win, in part because if this race if Michelle Nunn doesn't get 50%,
right,
then it's going to go into a runoff, which will be very difficult. Will be very difficult to win. And this is a seat we should have won in 2008 outright, when Saxby Chambliss was able to pull it out over Jim Martin. And what we're seeing in Georgia, I think, is if the Democratic establishment had really invested in a ground game, but we also have an election system that's rigged against low-income and minority voters. There's 40,000 voter registration cards that were collected by an amazing group called the New Georgia Project, that Secretary of State's office just is holding hostage. And those people aren't going to be able to vote. Not only will they not be able to vote, but if you're not registered for the general, you can't vote in the runoff. So we see a rigged system, and we see a Democratic candidate doing really well just because Republicans are revealing themselves for what they really are, which is corporate tools that don't actually care about everyday Georgians. And even in a conservative state like Georgia, voters are starting to wake up. The question is, will they have enough time?
How are they going to get away with that 40,000 registrations? I don't understand that. I've been trying to follow that story. It just seems crazy to me.
Yeah, and after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, it's hard to say how we can federally intervene in these cases where this happens in the state. And the deal is it's going to have to be fought out in the courts, and that's not going to happen until after the election, and then it's too late.
All right. Well, Becky, is there any way, we're participating in a Call Out the Vote program this week, but is there any way that folks want to get involved in what Credo is doing, the Super PAC? What can they do?
Oh my gosh! Well, especially if you're in, Kentucky or Colorado or North Carolina, you should go to CREDOSuperPAC.com and look up your local office. We would love to have you come down, and any listeners who are in state, and join with your neighbors and being part of a massive and progressive get out the vote effort. So check out CREDOSuperPAC.com if you're one of our 5 states, and we will put you to work in person with local progressive neighbors who are doing amazing work. And it's great that your national listeners are participating in these out-of-state efforts. We're really focusing our efforts on in-state folks talking to in-state voters because that's the most effective way to get them to the polls. So we'll take the local volunteers, and it's amazing. Everyone else is calling in from out of state. Thank you for that.
Becky Bond, president of Credo Super PAC. Thanks so much for joining us and for the work you're doing.